this is Ted Rogers on History by the Plate. Today we're going to be finishing our three-part series on the proper use of salt. Now, did you know that our word, salary, actually derives from salt? It does. You see, back in ancient Rome, generals would procure extra salt rations for their foot soldiers. These extra salt rations were called salarium argentum, from which we get our word salary. In the ancient times, salt was considered so important, it was actually used as a means of currency. It was used as money to pay for things. And in Greece, with their ever-flourishing slave trade in ancient times, the proper price for a slave was that slave's weight in salt. So then, if that slave was not considered industrious, he was said to be not worth his salt. So, salt is probably the most common seasoning used in kitchens across the world. However, it's probably also the most misused of all of the seasonings. In our first video on this subject, we looked at how to use salt to draw out the flavor of vegetables. In our next video, we looked at the timing of the use of salt in cooking ground meat, specifically a burger. And we noted that if you salted the burger too early, then the burger was going to have a mushy consistency. So for ground meat, you need to salt the meat just before it goes on the grill or into the frying pan. However, for steaks, for a chunk of meat, the opposite is true. So let's take a look at that, the last part of the series on salt, on how to cook the perfect steak. Because cooking the perfect steak begins not in the evening when you're getting ready to grill it or to put it into the pan. It begins the morning you're going to cook. So come on, let's go on into the kitchen. Okay, so what we have here are two very nice ribeyes. We've got some nice marbling throughout both of them. They're really nice looking steaks. And those are for tonight. It's about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning right now. So what we're going to do with the steaks as regards salt is exactly opposite of what we did with the burgers as regards salt. We're going to salt and season the steaks very early. We're going to start now. I have some kosher salt here. And what you want to do whenever you're seasoning something, go up high because you get a more even distribution. And we're seasoning the steaks. And use more salt than you think you're going to need. This is kosher salt, which is about half as salty as what we would use as normal table salt. So feel free to use plenty of it. Whoop, spilled a little there. Reminds me of Julia Childs, although I'm not in her league. Again, plenty of salt here. More than you think you need. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the pepper. And again, from way up high, it gives you more even distribution. Liberally pepper the meat. Adjust the grinder here to get a little bit coarser grind. There we go. Okay, now we're going to flip these over and do the exact same thing on the other sides. See, isn't that nice? I love the veining of the fat through that. So again, You get a more even distribution if you do the distribution from up high. So we're using, again, kosher salt. And this is just going to be so tasty. But also, it may look like I'm using too much. I'm really not. And there's a trick here. Why you want to salt a steak early is this. If you remember, we said kosher salt didn't mean that the salt itself was necessarily kosher. It was used in the process, though, of koshering, which is to draw the blood out of meat for the Jewish practice of making a meat kosher. Now, that's what this is going to do initially. It's going to pull the moisture out of the meat up to the surface. But then, what's going to happen is nature abhors a vacuum. So, once that's happened, now I'm going to pepper this again. Once that has happened, the meat is going to then respond to that vacuum and draw the moisture back in to the steak, to the meat, but it's going to draw that moisture back in with the salt. So you get an even distribution then of the salt throughout the meat if you start several hours, and I mean by several I mean a good 5 or 6 hours minimum before you're going to be cooking the steak. So we've got that taken care of now, and all I'm going to do is take a piece of plastic wrap here, assuming I can get my fingers on it, and cover this. Always hard stuff to work with. And just cover it lightly. You just want to make sure it doesn't dry out. And I'm going to put this in the fridge. So, in about, well, let's see, it's about 10 o'clock, and we're going to be plating up, try to plate up around 7. So, we've got a good 9 hours for the salt to work its magic with the meat. And it's not going to adversely affect the texture of the meat at all, like it would if we were doing this with a ground meat. So let's come on back later on when we're getting ready to cook. See you then. Okay, so we've had about 9 hours that passed now, and I think what you can see, I've tried to zoom in on the steaks here. So what you can see now is, if you recall in the last shot, you could see the salt on the surface of the steaks. Now all you can see is this wonderful veining of the fat, but also the pepper. But the salt, as we talked about, has now been absorbed into the meat. It pulled the moisture up out of the meat, but as we said, nature abhors a vacuum, and so the meat worked to pull that moisture back into the meat with the salt, and so that's why we're not seeing any of the salt here. Now what I'm doing is I'm bringing the pan up to a medium to medium low temperature, and what I'm going to do then is add some butter. And what I have here is a nice European butter. There are several different brands you can choose from, but I like the European butters because they have a higher smoking point. That is, they're not going to start catching on fire, they're not going to start burning, they're going to still taste buttery at a higher flavor than most, not all, but most of our North American butters. But again, too, you can make your own butter. There are several good videos I know of on how to do that. Okay, so the general rule of thumb here on cooking with a pan that's not a non-stick pan is you go for a hot pan, then you add the cool or cold oil, and then your food won't stick. And frankly, it works perfectly. I've added butter here, and I've used a European butter, which has a higher smoking point that I think I mentioned before. And what I'm going to do is turn this up now, and I want to add the steak right before this starts to brown. And this might look like it's a bit too much butter. It's not, because you'll see what I'm going to do here in just a second.
Okay, you hear that nice sizzling sound? Doesn't that just make you hungry? It reminds me of my old days back when I was a stockbroker, and I was always taught, drilled into my head, you don't sell the steak, you sell the sizzle. Well, here's the sizzle. And here's the steak. I think, personally, one needs both. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to add those. And to turn them, I'm not going to use a fork. I'm going to use these because I don't want to pierce the coating, the crust that I'm going to be developing here on the steaks. So we're going to let that go. I've turned it up now to a nice medium high. And what I'm going to do now, and this is a lost art in North America, but you'll find it across the world, is I'm going to tilt the pan. This is why I have extra butter. And I'm going to start to ladle that to marinate, basically, as we go. And what that does is it helps the fats in the meat to melt, because you need to get the meat to about 140 degrees. That's what we would consider medium rare before the fats actually start to melt. And here's a way to enhance that by just doing this. And this will increase the flavor in your meat by a good 50%. I'm going to put the spoon aside because we're going to do that again even when we flip this over. So we're just going to let this saute for a bit. And how long does it saute? That depends on a lot of factors. How thick is the meat? How well do you want it cooked? If it's a non-marbled piece of meat, then by all means, go for rare if you like rare. I love rare. If it's a well-marbled piece of meat, understand that the meat has to be cooked to at least 140 degrees before you're going to release the fats in the meat that'll draw out the flavor. So just think on that. But we're going to let this saute for just a little bit. Okay, so again, I've used a good quality butter. This is a European butter, and you can see that we're getting minimal smoking at most here, and this is now on high heat. And what I'm going to do, okay, now you see what I did by drenching that in the butter is on top, is that release the fat and release the connective tissues. So I'm going to use, in addition to this, a spatula to help me flip this over. And then you're going to see, okay, yeah. Isn't that what it's all about? A nicely browned exterior. And, believe it or not, I'm cooking this to medium rare for my wife and I. So you get, this isn't going to be exactly what you call black and blue, but it's going to be very, very close. This should be incredibly tasty. I'm just going to give this 2 more minutes on this side. Okay, those 2 minutes are over. This is nicely browned on both sides. So what I'm going to do is just remove this now, set it on a plate. And what we want to do, we don't want to plate this up right away. What we want to do is set this aside so it can sit for about 4 to 5 minutes. And that's because you want the muscle tissues in the steak to re-firm, so they can just kind of go roof. And we also want then the juices in these 2 beautiful steaks to pull back into the steak again, so that when you cut into it, you have a beautiful, succulent, juicy steak. So I hope you found this helpful. This is Ted Rogers on History by the Plate. Please visit our website, www.historybytheplate.com, for plenty of other recipes and videos. I hope this is helpful. Have a great evening and good eating.